A crumpled $5 bill slid across the mahogany table, pushed by a trembling 7-year-old hand. The most feared man in Chicago looked down at the little girl. "Buy my mum back," she whispered, before the monsters hurt her again. Those words instantly froze the blood in his veins. The rain in Chicago had a way of washing the grime from the streets while leaving the city's darker sins untouched. Inside the VIP lounge of the Velvet Room, the air was thick with the scent of expensive bourbon, Cuban cigars, and quiet, absolute authority. Paul Russo sat at the head of a sprawling leather booth, his tailored charcoal suit catching the dim amber light. At 32, Paul wasn't just a part of the city's underworld. He was the architect of it. The Russo Syndicate controlled the docks, the unions, and the underground casinos. He was a man made of ice and razor blades, a boss who ruled through calculated terror and an unbreakable code of silence. His men called him Il Padrino. The cops called him a ghost. His right-hand man, Matteo Rossi, was in the middle of summarizing the week's collections when a commotion broke out near the heavy velvet curtains at the entrance. "I said, I need to see the boss!" A high-pitched, desperate voice echoed. Paul raised a single dark eyebrow. His enforcers, 2 hulking men named Leo and Carmine, were visibly struggling, not with a rival hitman or a wired informant, but with a tiny girl. She couldn't have been older than 7. She wore a faded yellow raincoat, a size too big, dripping water onto the pristine Persian rug. Her pigtails were unraveling, and she had a scraped knee, but her green eyes were blazing with a defiance that stopped Paul mid-sip of his whiskey. "Let her go," Paul ordered. His voice was a low baritone, quiet but carrying enough weight to make the enforcers instantly release the child. Matteo tensed, his hand resting instinctively near his holster. "Dom, this is a security breach. We don't know who sent her." "She's a child, Matteo," Paul murmured, never taking his eyes off the girl. "Step forward, Piccola." The little girl marched right up to Paul's table, completely unfazed by the intimidating men surrounding her. She reached into the pocket of her oversized raincoat, her tiny fist clenched tight. With a slow, deliberate motion, she slammed her hand down on the polished mahogany. When she pulled her fingers back, a crumpled, damp $5 bill lay flattened on the wood. Alongside it sat 3 copper pennies and a half-melted butterscotch candy. "I need to hire you," she said, her voice shaking but her chin tipped up proudly. Paul stared at the meager offering. In his world, men paid hundreds of thousands of dollars just for a meeting with him. Politicians signed away their souls for his favors. Yet here was a child offering him pocket change. "Is that right?" Paul leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees so he was at eye level with her. "And what exactly are you hiring me to do? My rates are usually a bit higher than $5 and a piece of candy." "My name is Lily," she said, taking a deep breath. "Lily Hayes. I need you to buy my mom back." Paul's expression remained impassive, but a tiny fracture formed in his cold exterior. "Buy her back?" Lily nodded, tears welling in her eyes but refusing to fall. "There are bad men. They wear suits like you, but they smell like dirty smoke and old beer. They come to our bakery every week. They took my mum's wedding ring yesterday. The man with the snake tattoo on his neck told her that if she doesn't have the money by Friday, she belongs to him." Matteo cursed under his breath. "Snake tattoo? That sounds like Silas O'Connor's crew. Bottom feeders running loan shark rackets in the South Side." Paul ignored Matteo, keeping his focus entirely on Lily. "Why come to me, Lily? Why not the police?" It was then that Lily spoke the words that shattered the impenetrable fortress Paul had built around his heart. "Mommy says you're the devil of Chicago," Lily whispered, her green eyes wide and utterly sincere. She cries when she hears your name on the news. But before my daddy died, he told me a secret." "What secret?" Paul asked, his voice barely a murmur. "He said the devil is the only one strong enough to scare the other demons away," Lily replied. "He said if the real monsters ever came, only the devil could protect us. Please, be my devil. Save my mum." The VIP lounge went dead silent. The only sound was the heavy rain beating against the frosted glass windows. Paul stared at the little girl, frozen. He said the devil is the only one strong enough to scare the other demons away. Paul hadn't heard that phrase in nearly 20 years. It was the exact phrase his own father had used before he was gunned down in the streets of Palermo. It was a philosophy of necessary evil, a ghost from a past Paul had buried deep. Slowly, deliberately, Paul reached out. His large, scarred hand picked up the damp $5 bill. He folded it neatly and slipped it into the breast pocket of his tailored suit. "Contract accepted," Paul said, his voice laced with a lethal, icy promise. "The candy, however, is on the house. Keep it." Lily's face lit up with a breathtaking smile. For a second, Paul felt a strange, unfamiliar tightness in his chest. "Matteo," Paul stood up, adjusting his cuffs. His eyes were dark, predatory. "Get a car ready, and find out everything there is to know about a widow named Hayes and a bakery on the south side. Silas O'Connor has forgotten whose city he breathes in." The dossier Matteo compiled was as tragic as it was common. Era Hayes, 28 years old. Widowed a year ago when her husband, a mechanic, died in a suspicious garage fire. He had left behind crippling medical debts from a previous illness, forcing Era to take a loan from the absolute worst kind of people just to keep her small, independent bakery afloat and put food on the table for Lily. The principal was $10,000. With Silas O'Connor's extortionate interest rates, she now owed $50,000, a sum a struggling baker could never hope to pay. The next morning the rain had cleared, leaving behind a crisp, biting Chicago chill. Paul parked his unmarked black SUV a block away from Sweet Haven Bakery. He hadn't brought a crew. He hadn't brought Matteo. This was a private contract. When Paul pushed open the glass door, a little bell chimed above. The scent of vanilla, fresh yeast, and cinnamon immediately enveloped him, a stark contrast to the sterile smell of gunpowder and blood he was accustomed to. The shop was modest, with peeling floral wallpaper and a display case that looked half empty. Behind the counter stood Era Hayes. Paul stopped in his tracks. The photograph in Matteo's file hadn't done her justice. She was breathtaking, but in a raw, unguarded way. Her auburn hair was piled into a messy bun, flour dusting her cheek and the apron tied around her slender waist. There were dark circles under her expressive, almond-shaped hazel eyes, painting a picture of profound exhaustion. When she looked up at him, her smile was a practiced customer service mask, but Paul could see the sheer panic vibrating beneath her skin. "Welcome," Era said, her voice soft but strained. "What can I get for you?" She didn't recognize him. Good. To the general public, Paul Russo was a shadow, a name whispered in fear, rarely photographed. He wore a simple black cashmere sweater and dark jeans today, hiding the lethal authority he usually projected in his three-piece suits. "A black coffee," Paul said, stepping up to the counter. He kept his eyes locked on hers. "And whatever you recommend." Era shifted uncomfortably under his intense gaze. "The almond croissants are fresh," she murmured, turning to the espresso machine. As she worked, Paul observed her. He saw the faint trembling in her hands as she steamed the milk. He noticed the stark absence of a wedding ring on her left hand, the ring Lily said had been taken as collateral. A familiar, dark rage simmered in his gut. Paul was a criminal, a murderer by society's standards, but he didn't touch women or children. Men like Silas O'Connor, who preyed on desperate widows, disgusted him. She set the coffee and a pastry bag on the counter. That will be $6.50. Before Paul could pull out his money clip, the bell above the door chimed violently. 2 men walked in, bringing the stench of cheap cologne and stale smoke with them. One was tall and wiry, with a prominent snake tattoo coiled around his neck. The other was built like a cinder block. Era froze, the color draining entirely from her beautiful face. She instinctively took a step back, her hand flying to her throat. "Afternoon, Era," the snake-tattooed man sneered. He didn't even glance at Paul, assuming he was just another nobody civilian. "Hope you've been baking up some cash. Boss wants his 50 grand. Tomorrow is Friday, but we decided to come a day early." I told you," Era's voice broke, though she tried desperately to keep it steady. "I don't have it. I gave you my ring. I need more time. Please, just 1 more month." "Time is expensive, sweetheart." The bigger thug laughed, walking over and slamming his fist on the delicate glass display case, making Era flinch. "Silas says if you don't have the cash today, we start breaking the ovens. And if you still don't have it, well, maybe you can work off the debt at one of his clubs. You're pretty enough." Ira let out a choked sob, backing up until she hit the wall behind the counter. Paul took a slow, deliberate sip of his black coffee. It was excellent. He placed the ceramic cup gently onto the counter. The soft clink of the porcelain seemed to echo in the tense room. "You gentlemen are interrupting my breakfast," Paul stated. His voice was smooth, quiet, and absolutely devoid of fear. The snake-tattooed man finally turned to look at him, sneering. "Beat it, buddy. Unless you want to lose teeth, take your croissant and walk out that door." Paul didn't move. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the crisp, neatly folded $5 bill Lily had given him yesterday. He smoothed it out on the counter. "I've already been paid for a job today, and my client was very specific about dealing with monsters." The thug scowled, pulling back his jacket to reveal a handgun tucked into his waistband. "Are you deaf? I said—" He didn't get to finish the sentence. In a blur of motion, too fast for the thugs to process, Paul closed the distance. He grabbed the tattooed man's wrist, snapping it backward with a sickening crack. The man screamed, but Paul had already pivoted. He drove his elbow squarely into the cinderblock thug's throat, sending the massive man crashing back into a table, choking and gasping for air. The tattooed man reached for his gun with his good hand, but Paul was merciless. He grabbed the man by the throat, lifting him an inch off the ground, pinning him against the wall next to the door. Paul's eyes were pitch black, the true devil of Chicago stepping out of the shadows. "Tell Silas O'Connor," Paul whispered, his voice a lethal hiss that made the thug tremble violently, "that Era Hayes's debt is cleared. If he or any of his dogs ever step within a 1-mile radius of this bakery or her daughter again, I won't just kill him, I will erase his entire bloodline from this city. Do you understand me?" The thug, turning purple, managed a frantic nod. Paul dropped him. "Leave, now!" The 2 men scrambled out of the bakery, stumbling over each other in their haste to escape the terrifying aura of the man they had just provoked. The bakery fell into a stunned, deafening silence. Paul took a breath, adjusting his cashmere sweater, his demeanor returning to calm. He turned back to Era. She was staring at him, her hazel eyes wide with a mixture of profound shock, awe, and burgeoning terror. She looked from his face to the folded $5 bill on the counter, and then realization dawned on her. "Who?" Era whispered, her voice trembling violently. "Who are you?" Paul looked at her, seeing the fierce, protective mother who had raised a daughter brave enough to walk into a Mafia den. He picked up his coffee cup. "I'm the man your daughter hired," Paul said softly. "My name is Paul Russo." Aira gasped, clapping a hand over her mouth as she stumbled backward. She knew that name. Everyone in Chicago knew that name. She hadn't been saved by a guardian angel. Her 7-year-old daughter had just sold their safety to the most dangerous crime boss in the country. The silence in Sweet Haven Bakery was heavier than the humid Chicago air rolling off Lake Michigan. Aira stared at Paul Russo, the infamous Devil of Chicago, standing in her quaint shop with blood on his knuckles and a half-drank cup of her black coffee in his hand. "Paul Russo," Aira breathed, her knees finally giving out. She slumped against the wooden counter, her hands gripping the edge so tightly her knuckles turned white. You're the head of the syndicate, the man who owns the Gold Coast. Why? Why would you help us?" Paul stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate, treating her like a startled deer that might bolt at sudden aggression. He reached into his pocket and placed the crumpled $5 bill back on the counter, right next to the cash register. "Because a client came to me with a job, Mrs. Hayes," Paul said, his dark eyes softening just a fraction. "And in my line of work, a contract is a contract. Lily paid my fee. Your debt to Silas O'Connor is erased." "Silas won't just walk away," Aira whispered, a tear finally escaping and tracing a clean line through the flour on her cheek. "He works for Declan Sullivan. They are monsters. They'll burn this place down just like they burned down Arthur's garage." Paul's posture stiffened. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Arthur, your late husband. The police report stated the garage fire was a tragic electrical failure. The police report was bought and paid for," Aira said bitterly, wrapping her arms around herself. "Arthur was a mechanic at O'Hare Auto Customs. A few weeks before he died, he was working on a vintage restoration, a 1978 Lincoln Continental. He told me he found something inside it, something that scared him. He wouldn't tell me what it was, only that it belonged to the ghosts of Chicago. 3 days later, the garage burned to the ground with him locked inside." Paul's mind raced, connecting the invisible threads of the city's underworld. O'Hare Auto Customs was a known front for Declan Sullivan's Irish crew. And a 78 Lincoln Continental? That era, that specific circle of ghosts, it pointed to the old regime. "Pack a bag," Paul ordered softly, pulling out his sleek black encrypted phone. "You and Lily are not staying in your apartment tonight. You are coming with me. I can't just leave." "Aira," Paul interrupted, his voice a low, commanding rumble that left no room for argument. "Sullivan's men will be back. If what your husband found was valuable enough to kill for, they won't stop at extortion. I gave Lily my word that I would protect you. Let me do my job." Within 20 minutes, 2 heavily armored black SUVs pulled up outside the bakery. Paul's most trusted men, Leo and Carmine, stepped out, their eyes scanning the street with professional paranoia. Aira, holding a sleepy and confused Lily by the hand, was ushered into the back seat of Paul's vehicle. They drove in silence to the Gold Coast, pulling into the secure underground garage of the Drake Hotel. Paul owned the entire penthouse level under a shell corporation, a fortress suspended in the clouds. Once inside, the sheer opulence of the penthouse, marble floors, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering Chicago skyline, and priceless art, left Aira speechless. But Lily immediately ran to the massive velvet sofa and bounced on it. "Are we having a sleepover with the devil?" Lily asked, her green eyes wide with excitement. Aira gasped. Lily, manners! Paul let out a sound that Era realized, with profound shock, was a genuine chuckle. It transformed his harsh, angular features, making him look devastatingly handsome. Yes, Piccola, we are having a sleepover. My men will bring you whatever you want for dinner. Later that night, after Lily had fallen asleep in a guest bedroom, the size of Era's entire apartment, Paul sat in his dimly lit study. Matteo stood across from the mahogany desk, holding a manila folder. "You were right, Dom," Matteo said, sliding the file across the desk. "I dug into the history of that Lincoln Continental. It wasn't just any classic car. It was originally registered to a shell company owned by Tony Accardo." Paul's eyes narrowed at the mention of the real-life historical boss of the Chicago outfit. Accardo was a legend, a man who ruled the underworld for decades and supposedly hid millions in untraceable bearer bonds and blackmail material before he died. Matteo tapped the file. "Here is what we know. The car, purchased at a blind auction by Declan Sullivan. Sent to Arthur Hayes for a frame-off restoration. The secret. Arthur found a hidden compartment in the chassis. We believe it contained Accardo's lost ledger, a little black book containing blackmail on half the politicians in the state, plus the locations of safe deposit boxes holding millions. The murder. Sullivan found out Arthur took the ledger. They locked him in the garage and torched it. The debt. The $50,000 loan was a smokescreen. Sullivan didn't want Era's money. He wanted an excuse to tear her life apart legally, searching for the ledger Arthur hid before he died. "Arthur hid it," Paul murmured, staring out at the city lights. "And he never told Era. He died to protect them." Paul walked out of the study and found Era standing on the balcony, the cold wind whipping her auburn hair around her face. She was wearing one of his oversized cashmere sweaters, looking vulnerable but fiercely resilient. He stepped out beside her, offering her a glass of aged Macallan. She took it, their fingers brushing. A spark of electricity shot up Paul's arm, a sensation he hadn't felt in a decade. "He hid something, didn't he?" Era asked quietly, staring out at the dark waters of Lake Michigan. "That's why they won't leave us alone." "A ledger," Paul confirmed, deciding in that moment to give her the absolute truth. Worth millions. More importantly, worth power. Power that Declan Sullivan wants. Era closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I don't have it. I swear to you, Paul, Arthur never gave me anything. The only thing he left behind was his old toolbox and a $5 bill he gave Lily for her allowance the morning he died." Paul froze. The $5 bill? He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out the crumpled note Lily had slapped on his table. He held it up to the light of the balcony. It looked completely ordinary. But when Paul tilted it, looking closely at the serial number printed in green ink, he noticed it. The numbers had been carefully traced over with a microscopic ballpoint pen. Not a serial number, a sequence of coordinates, and a locker number at Union Station. "He didn't leave you nothing, Era," Paul said, his voice thick with awe at the dead mechanic's brilliance. He left Lily the map. The rain returned to Chicago the next evening, a torrential downpour that matched the brewing storm in the underworld. Matteo had retrieved the package from Union Station using the coordinates on the $5 bill. Inside the rusty locker was a heavy, leather-bound book, smelling of age and engine oil. Tony Accardo's ledger. It was a nuclear bomb of information. "We have it," Matteo said, pacing the penthouse living room. "We can destroy Sullivan with this, or we can use it to expand the syndicate's reach into the state senate." "Burn it," Paul commanded without hesitation. Matteo stopped dead. "Dom, this is worth—" "I don't care what it's worth," Paul growled, strapping a Kevlar vest over his dress shirt and checking the magazine of his customized 1911 pistol. As long as this ledger exists, Aira and Lily are targets. We burn it, and then we cut the head off the snake. Before Matteo could argue, the penthouse alarms blared. A heavy, synthetic voice echoed through the intercom. Breach in the private elevator shaft. Multiple armed hostiles. Declan Sullivan hadn't waited. He had bribed someone in the building's security team. He was coming for the ledger, and he was coming for Aira. "Matteo, get Aira and Lily into the panic room, now!" Paul barked. Aira rushed into the living room, holding Lily tightly to her chest. "Paul, what's happening?" "Stay with Matteo. Do not come out until I open that door," Paul said, grabbing Aira by the shoulders. He looked deeply into her panicked hazel eyes. In that brief second, the walls of the ruthless Mafia boss crumbled, revealing the man underneath. "I gave you my word, Aira. I am the devil they fear. Remember?" He kissed her forehead, a fierce, protective promise, and shoved her toward Matteo. The reinforced steel door of the panic room hissed shut, just as the heavy oak doors of the penthouse were blown off their hinges by a shaped C4 charge. Smoke poured into the opulent living room, followed by the blinding beams of tactical flashlights. Half a dozen men in tactical gear poured in, armed with suppressed submachine guns. At the center of them walked Declan Sullivan, a burly, red-faced man with a vicious scar across his jaw. "Russo!" Declan shouted over the ringing in the air. "Hand over the ledger and the widow, and maybe I let you keep breathing." Paul stood in the center of the room, completely exposed, his posture relaxed. In his left hand, he held Tony Accardo's leather-bound ledger. In his right, a silver Zippo lighter. "You burned a good man alive, Declan," Paul said, his voice cutting through the smoke like a scythe. "You terrorized a woman and a child. You broke the rules of our world." Paul flicked the Zippo open. The flame illuminated his cold, pitch-black eyes. He touched the flame to the ancient, oil-soaked pages of the ledger. It caught instantly, blazing into a miniature inferno. Declan's eyes widened in horror. "No, kill him! Kill him!" Paul dropped the burning book onto the marble floor and moved with the terrifying speed that had earned him his violent throne. He dove behind a heavy mahogany pillar just as a hail of bullets shredded the space where he had been standing. The penthouse erupted into a chaotic symphony of gunfire and shattering glass. Paul was a master of close-quarters combat. He leaned out, firing twice. Two of Sullivan's men dropped instantly, precise shots to the chest. Leo and Carmine flanked from the hallway, catching the remaining thugs in a deadly crossfire. The air grew thick with cordite and the copper stench of blood. Paul moved relentlessly forward, a predator in his element, closing the distance to Declan. A bullet grazed Paul's shoulder, tearing through his shirt and biting into his flesh. But he barely registered the pain. He vaulted over a shattered glass coffee table, tackling Declan to the floor. The Irish boss swung wildly with a combat knife, but Paul caught his wrist, snapping it with the exact same brutal efficiency he had used on the thug in the bakery. Declan howled in agony. Paul pressed the barrel of his 1911 directly between Declan's eyes. "The debt is paid," Paul whispered, his voice vibrating with lethal finality. He pulled the trigger. Silence rushed back into the ruined penthouse, save for the crackling of the burning ledger on the marble floor. Paul stood up slowly, clutching his bleeding shoulder. He looked around at the bodies of Sullivan's crew, then at the ashes of Accardo's legacy. It was over. The ghosts of Chicago were finally put to rest. Paul walked over to the panic room and entered the override code. The heavy door swung open. Aira stood there, pale and trembling, shielding Lily. When she saw Paul covered in blood and soot, she didn't scream. Instead, she rushed forward, throwing her free arm around his waist, burying her face in his chest. "You're hurt!" she cried, looking at his bleeding shoulder. "I'm fine," Paul murmured, his good arm wrapping around her, holding her tighter than he had ever held anything in his life. He looked down at Lily, who was peering at him with wide eyes. "Did you scare the monsters away, Mr. Devil?" Lily asked softly. Paul dropped to one knee, ignoring the searing pain in his shoulder until he was eye level with the little girl. He pulled out the crisp $5 bill, which he had safely tucked away before the fight, and handed it back to her. "The monsters are gone for good, Piccola," Paul said, a genuine warm smile breaking across his face. "But keep the money. I think your daddy would want you to buy some ice cream with it." The $5 bill sits framed in the office of Sweet Haven Bakery, now the most successful pastry shop in Chicago's Gold Coast. Ira wears a new ring, a brilliant diamond that catches the morning light as she bakes. Paul Russo still rules the city's shadows, but every Sunday, the feared devil of Chicago can be found sitting in a sunlit booth, eating an almond croissant, entirely at the mercy of a little girl named Lily,